So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Hi. My name is Leon Hilton. I'm an assistant professor of theater and performance studies here at Brown, and I'm also one of the co-conveners of the Disability Studies Working Group, which is a new project this year that's been made possible with the support of the Kogut Institute of the Humanities. I am very pleased to welcome you to today's event, a talk and conversation with Professor Liat Ben-Moshe. Before I introduce our speaker and provide a brief outline of how today's session is going to be structured, I want to first thank my co-facilitator of the Disability Studies Working Group this year, Emily Lim Rogers, as well as all the folks at Kogut, Amanda Anderson, Damien Mahie, Rachel Ulm, Gregory Kimbrell, Benjamin, everyone who's done so much to make this event possible, as well as all of the events in the Disability Studies Working Group this year. I encourage you to find information about a number of exciting upcoming events that we have for the remainder of the semester at our website, which is on the Kogut Institute for the Humanities page. I believe there's a link in the chat that's being shared. And you can also sign up for our email list to stay up to date with upcoming events and announcements. I also wanted to note that remote cart is available for this event, and you can access it by simply clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Great. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today. Liat Ben-Moshe is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is the author of Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization, and Prison Abolition from the University of Minnesota Press. And I believe we're also going to be able to share a link where you can purchase the book in the chat as well. She's also the co-editor with Allison Carey and Chris Chapman of the book Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the United States and Canada. Dr. Ben-Moshe holds a PhD in sociology with concentrations in women and gender studies and disability studies from Syracuse University. So when Emily and I were formulating ideas about speakers and events that we really wanted to bring to Brown during our first year of this Disability Studies Working Group, inviting Professor Ben-Moshe was absolutely at the top of my list. This is not only because her scholarship at the intersection of disability studies, mental health studies, incarceration and critical prison studies, and social theory take up some of the most urgent and pressing issues facing us today. It is also because of the way that she grapples with these questions, which for me, I think really models what disability studies could and should be at its best. She and I first had the opportunity to work together when I was actually a graduate student, and she and I were working to co-edit a dossier on the emergence of kind of critical mad studies and thinking it together with questions of affect and violence for the journal American Quarterly. And I just learned so much working with her about how to pursue critical, historically grounded research and theory in this field, and how to make that research and theory really be grounded in a commitment to the material realities that shape disabled and incarcerated people's lives, and understanding those realities and also transforming them. So in her book, Decarcerating Disability, Ben-Moshe brings the critical apertures of prison abolitionism to bear on the largest exodus of people from carceral facilities in the 20th century, the widespread closure of disability institutions and psychiatric hospitals. The book is a call, she writes, to address incarceration and decarceration as disability issues, where those oppressed by it are disabled or identify or are politicized as disabled or not. In addition to providing a much needed historical account of disability decarceration in the 20th century, though, the book also puts forward a larger vision for what she calls disability abolitionism, which is, she says, about creating a world without the necessity and footprint of incarceration and segregation, with all that entails for distribution of resources and social values, end quote. In order to achieve such a world, she writes, quote, an accompanying shift must occur in mindset, a non-segregationist logic, a radically different approach to dealing with harm and difference has to take hold for these changes to not just be reformist, but abolitionary and sustained. So I'm so excited to have her with us today. And before I turn it over to her, just wanted to kind of quickly provide a brief overview of how we're going to organize the next hour. Dr. Ben-Moshe is going to speak to us about her book for about 20-ish minutes and do a presentation. And then we'll come back and she and I are going to have a discussion about a few key issues that are kind of related to the book, but not necessarily covered in it, including focusing on some things that are happening in our state in Rhode Island right now, particularly surrounding Eleanor Slater Hospital. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A with the audience. You can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window, though only myself and Liat will be able to see the question. So when we get to that portion, I'll look at the questions and we'll have a discussion with all the attendees from there. But for now, I'm happy to turn it over to Liat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leon. That was so great. Such a great introduction. And I'm like, when we were young and, you know, but really, thank you so much for inviting me here. And thank you so much for your continued work to develop disability studies and med studies in Brown and nationally as well, which is, you know, our paths have crossed various times through American Studies Association and other associations, and trying to promote disability in med studies is not a small feat in these environments. So thank you for your kind of continued pushing for that. And I just wanted to do a quick introduction. So I'm in Chicago, and Chicago is on the traditional territory of the three fire people, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And I'm also, you know, would like to thank the people who are doing the behind the scenes here, Hannah and Ben and our lovely captioner and everybody that's doing all this labor for this talk. And so I'm going to share my screen now with the slides. So this is based on, like Leon was saying, on my book, Decarcerating Disability. What I'm going to try to do in this talk, and I'm going to put my timer now, is 3 lessons, and I might only get to 2. We shall see how it goes. I'm going to talk about what is carceral. I'm going to talk about what is deinstitutionalization, who's against it, what can we learn about it from about abolition, and then some critiques about disability rights and inclusion. And lastly, I'm going to end with some thoughts about carceral ableism and saneism. And I'll define all of these things, so don't worry. So what I try to do in a lot of my work, including the books that Leon mentioned, Disability Incarcerated, and now Decarcerating Disability, with a lot of other people, is to broaden what gets to be defined as incarceration and decarceration. This is where the word carceral comes from. So to understand what is carceral or what is incarceration as something that happens in a variety of places. So not just in prisons, you know, when we say incarceration, people immediately think prisons and jails, and of course that too. but also nursing homes, also institutions for people with developmental disabilities, also psychiatric hospitals. These are all sites of confinement. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that psychiatric confinement or institutionalization is like being in prison. So I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is that they are both carceral. I'm not doing this as an analogy to prison. Both prison and psychiatric confinement or disability institutionalization are carceral. They are both closed settings. People can't leave. People can't make decisions about their own lives. And disabled people describe their experience there as incarceration. So what I think we need to understand the connection between different sites of incarceration, but not through analogies like I just explained. And what this helps us is it helps us to understand the connections between what some people call the therapeutic state and the carceral state. And so, for example, and this is something we'll talk about after I shut up, is an incident in Rhode Island in a psych facility involving a contraband search that involved 12 Department of Correction officers. What are they doing in a psych hospital? They don't work there. So there's an entanglement, again, connection between psychiatry and between Department of Correction, or between the therapeutic state and the carceral state. And these entanglements, I want to be very clear, are gendered and are racialized. So if the network of incarceration is connected, then the means for liberation needs to connect as well. And this is what led me to connect deinstitutionalization and disability to prison abolition. When I say disability, I mean disability in a variety of ways. Particularly, what I'm trying to do in the book is what I call a CRIP/MAD of color analysis of incarceration and abolition. What I mean by CRIP/MAD of color analysis is an analysis that comes from the lived experience of people with disability, understanding disability analytically. What do I mean by all these words? What I mean by understanding disability analytically is exactly what Leon is trying to do here in Brown, which is develop a framework of disability and MAD studies. Understanding disability not just as a category, a label, something to be fixed, but as generative, something that produces things, including producing knowledge. And so the book is written very much, and the analysis that I'm trying to forward comes from the perspective of people in disability and med studies and their understanding of what that means. Secondly, this form of analysis also looks at disability as a way to view the world, as a lived experience. And hopefully through the kind of 3 examples that I give very short, in very short form, you'll get a grasp of this. But you know, I identify as a person with disability. I'm very apparently a person with disability when I'm not on Zoom, and visibly disabled, but I wasn't politicized as disabled until I met up with other disabled people, until I found community, until I found that we have a history, that we have a culture. And this is what a CRIP/MED analysis is through that understanding that we have a history and a culture. And so disability is absolutely a source of pride, but also, of course, of oppression. And understanding disability social movements in our understanding of abolition and prison is incredibly important. And particularly today, I'm going to focus on one case of the history of disability resistance, which is what the book is about, deinstitutionalization. So when I say abolition, I identify as an abolitionist. When I started the project, I think I was maybe a little less identified as an abolitionist. I wasn't not an abolitionist, but I don't think I knew as much about it. This is 15 years ago. when when a lot of us who are abolitionists go around and we kind of talk to other people who are maybe on the fence about it, they understand the critiques of the carceral system, but often what people say is, well, abolitionism is not prescriptive. It represents a utopian vision of the world. It's unrealistic with the world we have now. I mean, it's a great ideal, but what do you mean a world without prisons, a world without institutions, a world without these carceral spaces? I mean, yeah, sure, that's wonderful, but like, surely it can't happen in the United States, like maybe in Sweden, maybe in the future. And what is helpful about deinstitutionalization is that it's not in Sweden or in the future. It's in the United States and Canada, and it's in the past and the present. And so if we understand deinstitutionalization as a form of carceral abolition, if you follow me so far, it's carceral because people are institutionalized. Deinstitutionalization is something that has happened already in the US, and we can look at it as a precursor to other forms of abolition. So what is deinstitutionalization? So this is lesson number 1 for today. Deinstitutionalization, and it's fine if people don't know anything about this. When I say deinstitutionalization, I mean the transition of people with mostly psychiatric or intellectual or developmental disabilities from institutions and hospitals into living in the community. Secondly, it's about the closure of the facilities, so closing down psychiatric hospitals and institutions for people with disabilities. And no new admissions, basically not admitting anybody anymore. So it's not just moving people from one institution to the other, but it's closing them down. But what I add to that definition, which is the first 2 things are pretty standard definition of deinstitutionalization, what I add to it is that deinstitutionalization is not just something that happened. It's something that people fought for. It's a process, it's a logic, it's a framework. And it's a logic that counters carceral logics. It's a logic that counters the fact that people need to be segregated on the basis of disability, that people need to be safeguarded on the basis of disability or harm or difference. And what I try to do in the book is to really complicate the narrative that we have around deinstitutionalization. So a lot of people understand deinstitutionalization as the state cuts down a lot of its funding and they force a lot of these facilities to close, like psychiatric hospitals, disability institutions. This is in the 70s and 80s and 60s. But again, it's not just something that happened. It's something that people fought for. And by people, I mean people with disabilities. And of course, their families and allies and, all of that, and lawyers. But most of the time when people talk about deinstitutionalization, they don't talk about the social movements. They don't talk about the actual lived experience and the lives of disabled and mad and psychiatrized people. And so it's really important, or was important to me, to kind of bring that to the forefront of our understanding of deinstitutionalization. Because what is happening now is that instead of learning from the lessons of deinstitutionalization about abolition, or about how to close things down, or about a lot of things, it often is blamed for the rise of imprisonment in prison and jail. And you might know this from slogans like Cook County Jail, LA County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the US. Prisons are becoming the new asylums. You might have heard all of this stuff. So this is a kind of a repeated story, pretty much since at least the 80s, and definitely is repeating now. So I want to, kind of start with that and say that deinstitutionalization did not cause the rise of imprisonment. People did not become, so a lot of people think that people exited institution, they ended up homeless on the street, and then they ended up in jails and prisons. But this is not how it happened. People didn't become homeless because of deinstitutionalization. They were not incarcerated because of deinstitutionalization. And certainly they were not incarcerated or homeless because they needed to be in an institution, period. Why people are homeless? Why are people in prisons? Well, this is because of forces like racism and neoliberalism and privatization and budget cuts at the exact same time that a ton of money was taken from any kind of subsidized housing, welfare, education, anything, what today we call neoliberalism, that started in the end of the 70s. And the budget went into corrections. This has nothing to do with deinstitutionalization, or very little to do with deinstitutionalization. The cutting of the fund, yes, has a lot to do with deinstitutionalization, the closure of the facilities, and then at the same time, not putting anything in their place, community mental health clinics. It was all supposed to be funded. It never was. And so the issue is that by painting deinstitutionalization as the scapegoat for why people with mental health differences are in prisons, the disabling effect of the prison itself remain intact. Prisons are very disabling. So the reason why you see a lot of people with mental health differences in prison is because of prison. It's not because they need to be in a different prison, which is an institution or a psych hospital. And lastly, it also dissuades us from understanding deinstitutionalization as a really kind of revolutionary framework and a movement, because deinstitutionalization didn't fail because people advocated for it and were wrong. It failed by design. It failed purposely. The money was never went there. The services never opened. So this is not a failure of the imagination. It's literally what the state does. And to this day, it's the biggest decarceration movement in US history. So I don't have time to go into lesson 2, so I'm going to skip to lesson 3, but I'll just say what lesson 2 is, which is in the book I talk about who resists the closure of institutions and prisons, which is unions, employees of the facilities, and in the arena of institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, it's a lot of parents also and siblings, so family members who resist the closure of these facilities. And the reason why the family members resist specifically is because of this idea that this is the best place for my kid. And the kid, by the way, is usually over 60, because deinstitutionalization has been a trend since the 1960s in mental health and in developmental disability since the 70s. These are not children that go into institutions. They were children, but they are now full grown adults. So this is something that I talk about a lot in the book. And then the other thing that I talk about in the book is what is the price we pay for life outside of the institution. And the price is basically the erasure of difference, meaning that the kind of inclusion that these parents, employees of facilities, people who resist the constructions of group homes, of recovery facilities, the kind of inclusion that they're building for us or imagining really legitimates the segregation of certain population. So, in the book, I give a lot of examples for this, but the basic idea here is that by including some disabled people, letting them, kind of out of the institution and into the quote unquote community and defining what the community is, all that discourse, what it does is that it creates the further segregation of other people, including other disabled people. So I want to end with the last lesson, which is the difference between reform and abolition. So one of the things that we can learn from deinstitutionalization is how does change happen? And what are the kind of drawbacks of different tactics for change? So, for example, when we talk about overcrowding, and we talk about, okay, surely people with disabilities don't belong in prison, particularly people who are psychotic, for example. Surely they don't belong in prison, right? Or surely people over like the age of 65, like what are they going to do, when they're released? Like just release people who are older, or release people who are younger, people who are under, 18, and so on. And this is what we call in abolition worlds, abolition by attrition, meaning we're going to kind of chip away, and little by little, we're going to decarcerate women. And then we're going to decarcerate people who are young, and then old, and then mentally ill. And what deinstitutionalization shows is that chipping at the margins doesn't necessarily break the center. So one example, which is what I'll end with, is the example of the role of exposés in lawsuits in deinstitutionalization. So this was most pervasive in the 60s and 70s, which was the era of disability rights, following, of course, civil rights, the era of racial uprising, of anti-psychiatry, all these movements. And so you started to see exposés of prisons, exposés of institutions, exposés of psychiatric hospitals, and a lot of lawsuits related to prison condition, to psychiatric hospital conditions. And what that did cumulatively is that it brought the plight, the suffering of people who were institutionalized and incarcerated into headlines in magazines and TV. So even if people who didn't know nothing about what's going on in institutions and psych facilities or prisons saw it. It saw it. So it created awareness around it for sure. It had a cumulative effect that brought to the public imagination these horrible conditions. But what that did, honestly, is that it made people ask for changes in the facilities and in the prisons. How come people are naked? Give them clothes. How come people don't do anything? Give them employment. How come the ratio of staff to incarcerated person is so low? Hire more staff. And what that happened, when these reforms started to happen, it actually made these institutions, these hospitals, last much longer. Because instead of saying, what is this? People are naked, segregated based on the fact that they're disabled. Let's close it down. That's not how it happened. The close them down came, a decade or so later. And so there's a lot of lessons here about, reform versus abolition. What happens when people ask for something and then get it, and and when that something is reform, it lengthens the institution. So in terms of lawsuits, a lot of these lawsuits in very famous cases were litigated for many decades, in which the institutions was kept alive. Sometimes with, started with, unfortunately, over 1,000 people in the case of institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, and then closed down with, 55, people, and then 10 people, and so on. But it took decades to accomplish that. This is what abolitionist Rachel Herzig calls tweaking Armageddon, is that critiquing the conditions of confinement doesn't critique the rationale for confinement. We're just tweaking Armageddon, is what she's saying. So the consequences here, and this is where I want to kind of end, is that disability or madness in these lawsuits, in these cases, in these exposés, really highlighted the conditions in prisons and in institutions, but it didn't come from the perspective that I mentioned earlier in my talk, that the perspective to understand disability as a lived reality. It's something generative, it's something that produces something, it's something that comes from social movements. It more understand disability as something we don't want to have. And so therefore we need, instead of overcrowding in prisons, let's make more prisons so there's less overcrowding, because we don't want people, to be disabled. I'm not saying we want people to be disabled. I'm just saying that these reforms are not necessarily those that came from movements of people with disabilities, and certainly not later on. So starting in the 70s and 80s, we see anti-psychiatry movements, self-advocacy movements really being very adamant that these places need to close down completely. Not overhaul, but complete abolition. And so this is my last slide. I wanted to kind of end here because most of my book is about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and a few cases from currently. Or I should say like the early 2000s, not so currently anymore. But right now, I think we can use this framework to talk about this idea of asking for reform while really wanting abolition. And this is what I'm calling carceral ableism or carceral saneism. So ableism is, of course, the oppression based on disability, and saneism is the oppression based on perceived or actual kind of mental health difference, or this imperative to be sane. So carceral ableism and saneism is the practice and belief that people with disabilities need some kind of special or extra protections. And this ends up legitimating and often expanding further marginalization, further incarceration, basically keeping the prisons and institutions alive, but in other settings. So for example, today, we also see how it works. For example, saying instead of police, we need to call social workers. And then, maybe they don't come with guns, but they come with warrants that end up taking your kids and institutionalizing you. People pushing for psychiatric confinement instead of imprisonment in prison and jail. Drug courts, homeless courts, mental health courts, mental health jails. So all of these are basically carceral expansion through this idea of carceral ableism and saneism. So I will end there so we can get to the discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think, yes, a lot to go into and sort of unpack, but I think one way we discuss possibly doing that would be to think a little bit about some of the issues that are currently happening around disability and kind of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization right here in Rhode Island. Has to do with this kind of ongoing question, I think, about what's happening in our own hospital system, and particularly the complex of institutions that are known as the Eleanor Slater Hospital that are controlled by the state's kind of behavioral health authority. And I think, related to your point about exposés and their role in the 60s and 70s and the kind of early years of deinstitutionalization, I think there's been some really excellent and important local journalism that has been covering this issue kind of on an ongoing basis and keeping it to whatever extent at the forefront, maybe not at the forefront, but at least on the on the table in terms of political discussions in the state. But for those who don't know, I can briefly sort of summarize and say that the Slater Hospital cares for a mix of patients with what's described as complex psychiatric and medical needs. So patients with intellectual and developmental disabilities, patients who are on ventilators. But the system has been under scrutiny for years over issues ranging from patient care to the condition of the buildings. In December of 2022, the Disability Rights Rhode Island, which is an independent advocacy organization, filed a report about the conditions of the hospital and this is being kind of litigated, and there's a kind of ongoing discussion about this happening at the level of the state legislature as well as the governor. So it's kind of an ongoing issue, and which has a long history in the same buildings, basically from dating the early 20th century. So I guess I wanted to just ask you, without expecting you to know all the particulars of the situation, how might we think about, the way some of these discussions are happening in relationship to your framework of disability abolitionism and carceral sanism as well. And would just, really be curious to hear your thoughts and any insight you could provide folks who are working on these questions here in Rhode Island.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And thank you for kind of bringing those examples to my attention. Of course, wherever I kind of go and I ask people about the local setting, I must say that there's a lot of similarities with other places. One way to kind of think about this is through the framework of deinstitutionalization as abolition. So, because it sounds to me, that's what's going on with that hospital is that some people are asking for like a restructuring of it, including people very high up. And what's going on is that there's also kind of protests and things from people who think that it's going to be closed. And the people high up are, saying, oh, we're not talking about closing it. We're just talking about like changing kind of what it does or can do to be less psychiatric or, whatever. And I think, and that's going on everywhere. So one way to think about it is to think about it through the lens of these closure fears. And sometimes that happens in literal closure hearings. So I've been to several of those. And it is really interesting, the combination of people that I mentioned earlier sometimes get like bussed in to these hearings. So you see people sometimes with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are wearing shirts that say something like, please don't close my home or something like that. And they talk about people who are verbal, not everybody is, but people who are verbal sometimes give testimony. People with intellectual developmental disabilities, they sometimes give testimony to, my friend Lauren is here and we like to play whatever. And also they serve puddings on Tuesdays and, all these kind of things. And it's really interesting because we don't hear from them kind of again, right? So they're bussed in for these hearings about not closing their home. The shirts usually have the union moniker or logo on it. I don't want to say people are used, but you can read it however you want to read it. I mean, I've been to several of these. This is all, kind of sponsored, funded by the union of employees, usually, that doesn't want to close down these facilities. And so a way to kind of shift the discourse is not to talk to that person about how Lauren, they can still be friends, like outside of the institution, and they can still have pudding and, all the things, which certainly people should do. But, connect people to self-advocacy, connecting people to their own people, which, of course, they don't like you to do. So self-advocacy nationwide are having a really hard time going into institutions to talk to their own people. And the only time we see them is in these like closure hearings, as supporters of the as people who are like against the closure, and also to talk to the employees, which is different than the unions, to talk to the employees about the variety of work opportunities that exist outside of the institution, for example. And then to talk to the unions about how human warehousing should not be a profession.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that, your discussion about the intertwinement of the therapeutic state and the carceral state was really relevant here, because I think um, the role that kind of medicalization or sort of like medical justifications kind of play in certain carceral logics, I think isn't always so apparent. But I think pointing that out is a really important kind of thing that we learn from your work, and how those two things can work in tandem, and um, are often sort of pitted, you know, seen as opposite, but also are always working in tandem as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add very quickly that means in actuality, because I don't know like who's here, but in actuality, that means that people who do the work of, working against prisons should also learn a lot about disability, and, disability is a political identity and social movements and deinstitutionalization. And same with people who do racial justice work, and so on. But also vice versa. I mean, I think a lot of disability advocacy, like the ones you mentioned,
Mhm.
don't necessarily see prison abolition and prison advocacy as like an allied thing. And I find that it's very fruitful to
Mhm.
often like just bring activists together.
Mhm.
And it's yeah, so it could be useful in this case as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We do want to, I think, maybe start to open it up for questions. So if people have questions or comments that they would like to contribute, feel free to write them at this point, and we'll try to, mm, uh, yeah, move through them. But as people are thinking as well, we could also, one of the other um, topics that we were mentioning as we were planning this was to think about some of the very, very recent policies and kind of legislation that's going on in places like New York City as well as California, um, around kind of the policing of people in mental health crises in particular. And so I just wanted to, yeah, hear your thoughts on this kind of most recent turn in the discourse around this.
Um, oh, sorry. So I'm just going to put in the chat. So for people who are not aware of what's going on, this is just there's two things. One is in New York and just nationally, really, it's kind of like sprouting everywhere, but it has the most infrastructure right now in New York, is the move by, in New York, it's Mayor Adams, the new mayor, to basically incarcerate people who are quote unquote homeless and are quote unquote mentally ill. And it's a reiteration of this idea. It's Mayor Coach, then Giuliani. I mean, we've seen it with so many mayors in New York of just removing people basically from the street, but for their own good, right? So this is not in some mayors' terms, especially the Giuliani and the conservative mayors, they didn't even try to do carceral ableism. Like they didn't give a crap. They were like, this is unsightly, tourists are not going to come here, but these more progressive mayors are trying to say, we're trying to help people. And the way to help them is to hurt them by putting them in jails, in prisons, but we're not calling it jails and prisons. It's, something else. And so, but sometimes it is literally jail and prisons. And sometimes it's psychiatric hospitals, and sometimes it's things that are kind of in between, like you were saying earlier, the kind of junction of carceral and therapeutic. In California, it looks a little bit different. So this is what I put in the chat. This is from the state of California. So this is not from activists. Like this is literally a fact sheet from the state. And I'm just going to read for people who can access the chat. So it says, it's a 2-page sheet, and it says Governor Newsom's new plan to get Californians in crisis off the street and into housing, treatment, and care. And this is, they're calling this, the acronym is CARE, courts, C-A-R-E, Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment. Court. So in order for people to get assistance, quote unquote, if you're housing insecure, you have to go through this CARE court. So anyway, you can read more about this here, but there's definitely this national trend for reincarceration of disabled people, or just the plain incarceration, because not in all states people were ever actually deinstitutionalized. Illinois is one of them, unfortunately, where deinstitutionalization here very slow and hardly happened. So in other states that are more progressive, we're talking about reinstitutionalization, particularly around madness and housing insecurity. And so, yeah, feel free to kind of ask more questions about that, but that's basically what's happening now. And I think that the framework of carceral ableism is helpful because this is done through at least a discourse of benevolence, right? So it's for their own good.
Yeah. Right. You know, one of the things that might be talked about as a kind of consequence of deinstitutionalization might also be the rise of sort of less visibly carceral or sort of apparently carceral forms, but also kind of forms of new kind of like electronic surveillance technologies that sort of allow people, quote unquote, to sort of not be institutionalized, but are still in some way subject to surveillance or, other forms of carceral logics. And I know that that's been a kind of topic of conversation within, people who are thinking about these issues from a kind of technological or kind of social standpoint as well. But I'm curious your thought about like, what would a kind of abolitionist, anti-carceral, anti-surveillance politics look like? I don't know if you have a thought about that at all. There's also another question, but maybe answer that first and then I can read the question.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what you think about it, because this is like your area. Yeah. You wrote this beautiful article, beautiful written, but obviously hard to read, about these cases of surveilling disabled, particularly neurodiverse people. I mean, of course, as abolitionists and for people who are interested, should look at James Kilgore's work, Kilgore, and he has a whole website with a group that he created around this resisting e-carceration, so electronic incarceration, including, of course, ankle bracelet, but that's only, I think, the most known example. There's so many forms of surveillance that abolitionists are thinking through. And of course, the answer is always the same, which is don't be fooled. I mean, this is just a expansion of carcerality. I mean, people talk about it, including progressive people, as an alternative to incarceration, but it's not. It's maybe an alternative to prison, if that. Usually it's on top of your prison sentence anyway. Like, it's not even an alternative to anything. It's just topping it off like a little bit and having you pay for it, which is another egregious thing. So it's really just about letting people be aware about even just the factual issues around electronic monitoring, that they're actually not an alternative.
Yeah. There's a really good question here, so I'll just read it out. It says, considering the assistance, support, and care that many disabled people need, do abolitionists have any prescriptions for other possible systems or communities of care that do not solely depend on the nuclear family in a neoliberal condition?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the short answer is abolitionists, like any community of people, don't necessarily agree on everything. So I'll give you like the overview, but just know that it's a very kind of simplistic answer, just because I don't have enough time. So the answer is more nuanced and should be, because the question is nuanced. Peer support, for example. So peer support, for example, would be something that abolitionists and anti-psychiatry people, med people, have been doing, asking for, and performing for a long time. And that would be kind of a structure of care that people are doing, often beyond the state, but not always. So there are forms of peer support, especially in mental health, that are paid by the state. Like you are paid to support other people. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just giving examples. But some of it do exist also completely outside of the state, and certainly outside of the kind of nuclear family. For example, people who have care collectives. So people who have high support needs, people with disabilities who have high support needs, who need help, or assistance with going to the bathroom, going to bed, getting in the chair, out of the chair, getting clothes on, all of the things of that nature. There's a few great examples of care collectives, both here and in Canada. Just the ones I'm personally familiar with, because I know the people. I'm sure there's like more. So that's another example of that. And so people basically volunteer their time, but it's more than that. You're like you're in a relationship, with that person, a relationship that's of course mostly non-romantic, but also non-family in the kind of nuclear way. You can call it queer kinship, you can call it, a variety of things, but ultimately it's about kind of the exchange of relationality, and centering people because they matter, not because of payment, and not because of, and so on and so on, which is what we do in nuclear families as well, right? Like we center people because we want them to grow, to succeed, to live up to their full potential, and so on. There's a new book by Akemi Nishida. I'll write that in the chat. It's called Just Care. I think that would be kind of useful to look at. And there's a bunch of other, of course, like a whole slew of literature. But, those are just kind of some examples of communities of care.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I guess maybe as a quick follow-up question or just thought, which is, one of the things that I really have learned a lot from your work about is how to kind of negotiate or navigate or toggle, right, between, real conviction and allegiance to the vision of abolition, not just as the kind of practical, dismantling of institutions, but also, as you say, to the dismantling of the kind of world in which institutions are necessary. And having that be the kind of like guiding principle that sort of, like motivates a lot of the research and the work. And I think you also toggle between, that vision and also the, as we say, sort of like lived everyday realities and practicalities of what does it mean to actually have to exist within that system, and to exist within a world that unfortunately continues to think that it needs institutions. And So I guess part of my question is, how do you do that? But it seems like maybe one of your answers is these kind of provisional, forms of either care collectives or other kinds of informal networks of care that have sort of risen up. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that and feel free if anybody else has a question or comments, feel free to put it in the Q&A. But thanks for saying that. I think that's what we do as abolitionists, like really truly. I mean, these are things that I learned from Angela Davis and reading Ruthie Gilmore, and being in community with a lot of abolitionist kind of long time activists and so on. This is the conundrum on which we live. Like, I think from the outside, it might be this kind of like reform here, abolition here, and don't even talk to me unless you're like, but that's not at all how we actually work as abolitionists, because we live here with people, right? And so I do think that that is the core of abolitionism. And I also think that, and this is just my own opinion, and not everybody that's an abolitionist thinks like I'm about to say, but that's also in the book and in an article that I wrote, that what makes abolition to me appealing is about letting go of particular ways of knowing. So this idea that we need a prescription, otherwise we can't do it, I think is not always helpful. Because this idea that often people say, okay, fine, like everything you're saying, the critiques, like I get it, and absolutely I'm with you, and it's all fantastic. But what do we do now? Like, what do we do with the Slater Hospital? Should we close? Should we not close? Like, what are you offering? And I think that brings us into a quagmire that is not liberatory, because these are questions for communities. These are the questions for the people who are most effective. This is questions that need to be answered by praxis, by doing, and by doing collectively. And also, I don't think it's very helpful to say, well, if you don't have a solution, then you're part of the problem. Like, I think that's a not very kind of nuanced or feminist way to think about problems and solutions.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that really answers your question. It's answering your question, which is I think that's the allure. To me, this is the allure of abolition. I know that's not the case for everybody. It's that it doesn't have always these what should I do, like in every particular case. Oh, I should say, it's not that it doesn't have it, it's that it's working towards it by trial and error, by doing it in community with other people.
No, absolutely. I think that's so well said. And almost it suggests an image of abolition as a kind of horizon that's always there, and that just by providing that perspective and saying that no, these institutions should not exist, that's never somehow in the conversation, or it's sort of outside of the terms of the conversation, right, in which a lot of these discussions happen. So I think that just insisting on that horizon of abolition, that is itself a really radical and kind of powerful position to hold. So it looks like we're right at the end of the hour. But I think, just want to thank you so much for opening up so many important lines of thinking and ways of thinking. And it's always just such a pleasure to have you in conversation. So I just want to thanks for your time, and also thanks to everyone who attended, and hope to continue the conversations in other formats as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and yeah,
Great.
thanks so much.